The economy expanded so dramatically, and the bluff persisted for such a long time that it gradually reached a point where it almost naturally transformed into reality. So, even if it's just a bluff, they still need at least $3 trillion to maintain stability. If it drops below that threshold, things start to get concerning. That's exactly what happened during the repo crisis in September 20. In order to address the issue, the Fed is adjusting its pace slightly. It's not because they're particularly excited about reducing rates by 60 basis points or scaling back on quantitative tightening. It's like they've switched to lighter uniforms for summer training. You think, this feels cooler, and that's the feeling they want.
Whenever there's a significant global economic event, many people begin to speculate about the different factors this event might bring into play and the direction the economy could potentially head in as a result. People become curious, and whenever that happens, we get absolutely flooded with comments and emails, urging us, saying things like, get this person on right away, stop focusing on anything else. It's not that we don't want to bring this guest onto SamPro TV right away, but even we have to wait our turn to get a spot. After putting in some effort and pulling a few strings, we managed to secure a shorter spot in the line. And today, we've finally got him here. So without further ado, here he is. Our guest, Mr. O. Welcome.
Hello there.
Yes, especially these days, after FOMC meetings and similar events, I'm sure people have been flooding you with all sorts of questions and inquiries. How should we look at this? What are your predictions?
Before we get into the main subject, I want to share a little aside. During the Chuseok holiday, there was an interesting news story. Apparently, people followed their navigation systems while driving.
Yes, I heard people ended up on narrow farm roads.
Yeah, a few ended up being trapped in heavy traffic for 5 hours.
It seems the navigation system suggested that route because it was a bit faster.
I've had a similar experience, and what I realized is that it resonates deeply with me. Nowadays, everyone has easy access to an abundance of valuable information. In the past, these kinds of roads were really only known to a handful of locals or regular visitors, isn't that right? But now, thanks to navigation systems, this information has been made public. So when large numbers of people choose to take the farm road, which was not originally intended to accommodate such a high volume of cars, that's when the problem occurs. And I thought this is very similar to what's happening in the financial markets. With platforms like SamPro TV and YouTube today, many people are gaining deep knowledge through advanced information. As a result, the complexity of the market has increased dramatically compared to the past.
Exactly, and that becomes a variable.
Just like when I look at today's high school entrance exams, they're so much harder than when I took them. The difficulty has skyrocketed to maintain a competitive edge. I was shocked when I saw those killer questions. What I want to point out is that as more people enter the market armed with tons of information, the speed of market reaction increases. Pre-reflection occurs rapidly. The rapid learning of the market is remarkable. The speed is quite noteworthy. I feel this a lot, especially when I look at the bond market. Take the US 2-year Treasury, for example. Its yield fluctuates by 20 to 30 basis points in a single day. This didn't happen much in the past. Now, one data point can move yields by 20 to 30 basis points, and it's tough to keep up.
Why is that? There are still experts in the bond market, right?
The difference from the past is this. Now we often say that individual investors couldn't enter the bond market like they could the stock market. But now the issue is this. Compared to the past, central banks have reduced their activity in the US Treasury market. China's and Russia's central banks aren't participating like they used to, so demand from central banks has decreased. Secondly, after last year's SVB crisis, US banks are holding fewer treasuries due to stricter regulations and tighter controls. So while Treasury issuance has increased, demand has fallen, right? If the issuance increases but demand stays the same, someone has to absorb that excess. And who's stepping in? Individual investors through ETFs. Many in our country invest in US Treasury ETFs, and Americans do too. Another major player is hedge funds, which have entered the market in large numbers. Hedge funds are buying long-term bonds with leverage. But individual investors typically don't have long-term investment horizons. You go in wanting to get out. They're not holding for 30 years. They'll sell when rates drop. Then short-term immobilization occurs in the US Treasury market, and a lot of leverage is applied.
That means volatility, right?
Yes, they say that interest rates will decrease, and when that occurs, they push it down hard. But if it rises, they say no and push it up forcefully. What I sense is this. When I'm observing the market, I often find myself deep in thought, and then all of a sudden the market shifts dramatically and unexpectedly. It makes you think, well, what's going on? But by the time you figure it out, it's already too late. And when that happens, you think, there's something I don't know. And then you react, throw something in.
Throwing yourself first?
Yes, and start watching closely, right? Then the market moves strongly in that direction. For example, when the Fed cuts rates by 50 basis points, should we expect rates to go down or up? Both directions are possible. So will it drop or rise? If you don't know, you just watch, and then it suddenly drops. That's how it goes. You invest and follow along. Then the market strengthens downward, but suddenly it reverses and rises again. Then you change course again, and the market keeps moving like that. It's different from the past, right?
There are more players now, and information spreads fast. Even if you stay calm, you know others won't, which makes it harder for you to stay calm too.
Let's go back to the navigation example. If I were a local, saw the highway jammed, and chose a back road without using navigation, what do you think would happen? Driving without it, I'd probably hit a hell, right? It's the case of what worked then doesn't work now. That's the way markets learn. As information becomes more open and asymmetric information decreases, it creates new forms of noise.
Aha, it generates a new kind of noise.
Yes, it is. Lately, I've been thinking it's not just that investing has gotten harder. No matter what changes or advancements happen, ultimately investing comes down to one thing. In the end, someone makes money and someone else loses it. That's just how it works. Not everyone can win, right?
Exactly, like how top universities have limited spots.
Yes, and as competition grows, it definitely gets tougher. After this Chuseok holiday, I realized that I need to study even more and put in a lot more effort to keep up.
I've been hearing the same thing in the real estate market as well. Sometimes, when policymakers gather informally over drinks and share off-the-record insights, they often end up saying the very same thing. In the past, certain strategies would work while others wouldn't. But now, with information spreading so rapidly, the landscape has changed. Shifts that used to take a year or two are now happening in as little as 3 months. It used to be that people would start to notice something and slowly take action. But now, within a week, everyone who needs to know already knows and reacts accordingly. They told me that this pattern of quick rises and falls is already happening in the real estate market.
In fact, the real estate market is more like an over-the-counter, OTC market, rather than an exchange-traded one like KOSPI. Local residents tend to have a distinct advantage when it comes to staying informed about what's happening in their area. Additionally, those who have been involved in the market for a long time often have a better grasp of the policies and how they might shift, giving them a significant upper hand. But now that's no longer the case. Yes, everything is so open and accessible now, and it feels like everyone dives deep into studying wherever there's money to be made or opportunities to be found.
That's right. And when people study deeply like that, doing it half-heartedly becomes the most dangerous approach.
And I've been thinking the same thing lately. If you look at central banks, for example, people's perspectives now are totally different compared to 5 years ago. In the past, people would ask, why do I need to know this? But now they offer their own interpretations saying, actually, it could be seen
I totally
this way.
agree.
It's impressive. During FOMC meetings, people stay up late to watch live updates. I'm amazed by how much things have changed. Sometimes it feels like we're in an era of macro overload or even information overload in investing. But I also think this transitional phase will help us level up bit by bit.
Ultimately, it's pushing the market to become more efficient.
Yes, that's what I've been thinking lately.
Let's take a look at the recent interest rate movements in major global economies. First, the FOMC cut the rate by 50 basis points. But before that, Europe actually moved first.
Yes, Europe lowered their rate the week before.
Let's talk about Europe first.
So, we heard the news about rate cuts, but this time it was a bit unique. In the Eurozone, they use what's called the refi rate, which stands for refinancing. This is what repurchase agreements are. When commercial banks circulate money among themselves, sometimes they run into problems. What if they run short of funds? There are times when they can't find a solution among themselves. When that happens, they turn to the central bank, which lends them money with a 7-day maturity. But what if they can't repay the loan in 7 days? Well, the central bank will refinance the loan, which means rolling it over. So they provide an extension, and that's what we call refinancing. When the central bank lends money to commercial banks on a short-term basis, the interest rate applied is called the refi rate, and that's the benchmark rate. Every central bank needs a policy rate they can control, and this is the one they use. The central bank adjusts the refi rate by raising or lowering it based on their policy.
In Korea, that is the benchmark rate, known as the 7 days repurchase agreement.
Exactly. It's almost the same thing. But then what happened was the Eurozone introduced quantitative easing. As they rolled out QE, they flooded the market with an enormous amount of money. This left European commercial banks overflowing with cash. Interest rates went negative, and there was even more money than in the US, leaving banks with no reason to borrow. As I mentioned, the refi rate is essentially the central bank's way of saying, I'll lend you money. However, with so much cash circulating, no one was really interested in borrowing. So whether the rate went up or down didn't make much of a difference. So what do? There's too much money circulating, causing market interest rates to drop continuously. As a result, the central bank loses control over the rates. So the central bank is introducing deposit interest rates. You might wonder, well, what's the deposit rate? The central bank can't take deposits from the public like regular banks. Only the government and commercial banks can deposit with the Bank of Korea. As a result, the commercial banks in Europe are allowed to open deposit accounts with the European Central Bank, ECB, where they can deposit funds and apply interest rates on those deposits. Here's how it works. Let's say the benchmark rate and the refi rate are 4.5%. Then they set the deposit rate at 4.0%. So if banks are lending money and someone else offers to borrow at 3.8%, there's no reason for the banks to lend at 3.8% when they can deposit at 4%. So the central bank absorbs that surplus money at 4%. No loans are given below 4%. Commercial banks, no matter what happens, won't lend below that threshold. Instead, they park their money at 4%, keeping things stable. That's how the central bank set a floor under the deposit rate. With excess cash, they set the deposit rate at 4.0%, the refi rate at 4.5%, and above that is the lending rate. Now, you don't really need to know about the lending rate, but it comes into play when banks are extremely short on cash and need emergency loans. In that case, other banks might say, can't you solve this on your own with a short-term loan? Why are you bothering the central bank? But if they keep insisting on borrowing, the central bank says, fine, but you'll face a penalty, which comes in the form of a higher lending rate. So the interest rates are as follows. The deposit rate is 4.0%. The refi rate, which is the benchmark rate, is 4.5%, and the lending rate is 4.75%. That's how it's applied.
By setting it up this way, market interest rates move within that corridor.
And stay within those boundaries.
That's how the US manages its benchmark rates, using a range for greater flexibility and control, right?
Right, it's a very similar system, but there are some differences between Europe and the US. In the US, they have two ways of pulling in liquidity. One is through the IOER and IORB rates for banks. These rates work in a similar way to how the deposit rate operates in Europe, serving a comparable function within their financial system.
That's for entities that aren't banks, right?
Yes. There's also a way to pull liquidity from non-bank institutions like hedge funds or agencies. In the US, since the market is more developed, these institutions can't use reserve accounts like banks, so the Fed uses the on-RRP rate. In the past, whenever I brought this up, people would respond with, who cares? Let's just move on. But these days, people consider this kind of information to be basic knowledge that everyone should know.
In the US, it's like having separate dining halls for enlisted soldiers and officers, while in Europe, there's just one dining hall.
Yes, exactly. Non-bank institutions like money market funds, MMFs, managing over $6 trillion, can't park their money in reserves like traditional banks. So, when MMFs have too much cash and nothing to invest in, interest rates fall. The central bank can't control this directly. That's why they use the ONRRP rate to manage both sides. This is how they usually control the system. In Europe, as I mentioned earlier, the financial market tends to be more bank-centered. There simply aren't as many non-bank financial institutions or money market funds, MMFs, playing a significant role, so the central bank mainly focuses on managing and regulating the banks themselves without needing to worry as much about the non-bank sector. Now, if you look at the article here, you'll see that the benchmark rate has been cut from 4.25% to 3.65%, a 0.6 percentage point cut. That's a big cut. The deposit rate dropped from 3.75% to 3.5%, a 0.25 percentage point cut. And for the lending rate, which is the highest. It went down from 4.5% to 3.9%, a 0.6 percentage point cut. Now, you might be thinking, why do they use three different rates? To summarize, ECB, they have three interest rates. First, there's the benchmark rate, which I mentioned is the refi rate set for 7-day loans. Then there's the deposit rate, which they introduced to control excess money. And finally, there's the penalty rate, also known as the lending rate, which is used in emergencies. The deposit rate acts as a floor, meaning rates can't go below 4. When banks borrow from the central bank for 7 days, the interest rate is 4.5%. But with penalties, it rises to 4.75%, slightly increasing the borrowing cost. That's the corridor we were talking about. So, as we mentioned earlier, there's this corridor in place, which sets the boundaries for interest rates.
So the interest rates typically stay within that corridor, right?
Exactly. For example, in June, when they first cut the benchmark rate, they lowered it to 3.75%. The 4.5% rate was brought down to 4.25%, and everything dropped by 25 basis points. The gap was maintained. However, in September, something different happened. The rate suddenly dropped to 3.5% with a 25 BP decrease, but then the other rate dropped by 60 BP. Suddenly, it went down to 3.65%. So the rates dropped by 60 BP, and the other rate also dropped by 60 BP, going down to, actually, no, it's 3.9%. My math got a little off there, but it dropped by 60 BP. And now when people look at this, they start to ask, is this a rate cut in the Eurozone as well? It raises questions and sparks discussions. However, it's hard to say this is a true rate cut. In some ways, this might actually be a form of tightening. Yes, it might be a bit confusing, so let me explain it briefly. Right now, banks have an abundance of money. So when banks have excess cash, they can set the floor at a certain rate, and while that rate is valid, the higher rates above it don't get used much. But what the Eurozone is doing right now is they are lowering interest rates, but simultaneously they are tightening quantitative measures significantly. So they had previously injected liquidity into the system through programs like APP and PEP, though those details aren't particularly important. Just think of it as them injecting money. By pumping money into the system, the bank's reserves ballooned significantly. As banks ended up with excess funds, they started managing that money by parking it into deposit rates of 4% to manage the excess liquidity.
Do you mean that the rate was actually the real interest rate? Did they begin quantitative tightening, QT?
Exactly. Up until now, because of quantitative easing, QE, and the injection of money, the two upper rates weren't really in effect, and it was mostly the deposit rate that was working. That's what's important.
There was so much money, the question was, at what rate would it be parked?
But now things are changing as QT, quantitative tightening, begins. When liquidity begins to decrease, some banks will eventually start running short on funds, struggling to meet their financial needs. So while some banks will still have plenty of cash, others will start running low. Since QT is implemented evenly, certain banks will end up facing liquidity shortages. When that happens, those banks will need to borrow funds to stay afloat. And when they need to borrow, they'll turn to the refi rate, showing a strong need to secure funding. That's the first key point. From this point on, while the deposit rate remains important, the refi rate will also start to come into play. And if more funds are withdrawn, some may even get caught up in the upper range. But if you think about it for a moment, let's assume, Mr. Lee, that you have 1 billion won sitting in a deposit account earning an interest rate of 4.0%. At the same time, for your business, you maintain an operating account with a different bank where you always need to keep at least 200 million won available for day-to-day operations and expenses. This is an essential part of managing your business's cash flow. So 200 million won is kept separately like this, but then something happens. Originally, securing 200 million won in cash was no problem, but suddenly it became difficult to get hold of. The first option is to withdraw from the deposit to cover the 200 million won. The second option is to borrow, but borrowing costs 4.5% interest. So the question becomes, would you rather withdraw from the deposit at 4.0% or take out a loan at 4.5%? You're essentially being asked, will you withdraw the money from your deposit or take out a loan at 4.5%? You'd likely withdraw from the deposit, right? Because the interest rate difference is lower. it's a 50 basis point difference. The bank might say, if you switch, won't there be hassles and inconveniences? No, 0.5% is a big difference. How much money is that? I'll still switch, but you'd lose the benefits you have. No, I'll still move. But suddenly, the loan interest rate drops to 4.15%. Now, the gap is only 15 basis points instead of 50. So, in that case, what would you decide to do? What's your next move?
In that case, some might consider borrowing from another bank, since it's just for a short time.
Yes, some people might decide not to change the bank even though it's a bit tricky. But then, if the difference was just 0.05%, even more people would choose not to go to another bank, because transaction costs come into play as well. So, if you look when the money is short, then in that case, you have to get it through the refi. But if the refi rate is 4.5% and the deposit rate is 4.0%, banks will see a significant difference, right? So when they're short of money, they will withdraw a lot from deposits. Then, as they proceed with quantitative tightening, the bank's reserve requirements will decrease, and as they withdraw more from deposits, the reserves can deplete very quickly. When that happens, the surplus money banks had will drop rapidly, and it becomes difficult to control. In such cases, what happens is the bank's money depletes too quickly, and this leads to significant disruptions in the short-term financial market.
But who is borrowing? Isn't it the bank?
Other banks can borrow like between the banks themselves, but those banks will ultimately lend to others as well. That's how the money flows out. And when money flows out like that, due to quantitative tightening, that's why people often say the side effects of quantitative tightening occur when the reserve requirements drop too fast after tightening begins. In September 2019, there was the repo crisis.
Sometimes banks are frantically calling each other.
Right. When there's a money shortage, banks that were previously fine suddenly find themselves in trouble. If I draw it out for you, it looks like this. Imagine a beach. You can see these sharp corals sticking out. If you hit them, you'd get hurt, right? There are people walking around, and they're hitting these sharp corals, getting injured. But then someone pours in a lot of water. As the water rises, if someone is floating on a tube, even if the coral is 2 or 3 meters below, it's no problem, because the water level is over 5 meters. This influx of water is what we call quantitative easing. Now, when the water is drained, we call it quantitative tightening. The water level drops. If we lower the level suddenly, when there are multiple people around, someone who is near the sharpest corals is going to scream out in pain. Then panic starts spreading among the people. They look down and think, wow, what's going on? And they'll all rush out of the beach, right? And everyone will say, don't lower the water level below this point. That's what happens in the financial market as well. Quantitative easing and tightening are asymmetric. During easing, you can keep raising the water level without any problems. But when you start lowering it, the ones at the highest risk get hurt first, causing panic. That is the repo crisis. Even the ones in safer positions will start to freak out and rush out of the water. So during quantitative tightening, as they slowly reduce liquidity, more and more banks start to pull their funds into the refi rate. As the reserves get drained, if too much is withdrawn, we'll hear a collective, oh no. This prompts the ECB to take action. As I mentioned earlier, when the deposit rate sits at 4.0% and the refi rate is at 4.5%, there is a 50 basis point gap. If that gap becomes too large, banks will avoid using the refi rate altogether. Instead, they'll simply withdraw from their deposits to cover their needs, bypassing the lending option entirely. That's why the gap can't be too wide.
When they feel short, right?
Yes, indeed. When liquidity is low, they pull from their reserves with the central bank. But as I mentioned earlier, when they narrow the gap to just 15 basis points, banks begin to wonder, should we withdraw or not? This hesitation results in a slower pace of withdrawals as they carefully consider their options. So in March 2024, the ECB introduced a new monetary policy framework. What this essentially means is that the current rates of 4.0%, 4.5%, and 4.75% will be adjusted downward. By September 2024, they plan to reduce these rates to 3.75%. The goal is to narrow the gap to just 15 basis points. ensuring a smoother and more stable process for quantitative tightening while maintaining market stability. This move aims to manage QT without causing any disruptions. This narrative suggests that significantly lowering interest rates isn't inherently beneficial. Instead, it indicates a determination to persist with quantitative tightening. It's more about being careful and steadily reducing the levels over time.
So those who need it should take out loans, right?
Yes, and they're also saying, if you want to withdraw from your deposits, go ahead and withdraw appropriately. That's the message they're conveying. If the water level drops too much, then people will withdraw as much as they can from deposits. As deposits decrease faster, there will be chaos at the refi window, right? Everyone will rush for loans, and eventually, you won't be able to withdraw from deposits. At that point, quantitative tightening would likely be halted. Once a risk signal emerges, they'll stop, as it's a clear danger signal. Personally, I think they've cleverly played on human psychology. When you're offered 4.0 or 4.05, people think, well, 50 BP difference, I'll go for it. But when it's reduced to 15 BP, people start to hesitate, thinking, now I'm not so sure. So they are adjusting based on the actual demand of the banks. This is how the system is approaching it. That's why they are taking this route to properly manage quantitative tightening. But since we're talking about it, even if the atmosphere isn't great, the Fed should give it another try, right? The Fed is a bit different.
So this QT thing, it's the first time humanity is trying something like this. That's why no one knows what side effects might emerge.
In fact, the Eurozone only experienced quantitative easing for the first time in December 2015. This is their first time with QT, so they're trying different approaches.
They can't let this fail.
Exactly. They need to minimize side effects and prevent chaos in the short-term financial markets.
It's like when soldiers are training in the summer and they're told to take off their heavy clothes and switch to lighter ones. At first you might think, the training's getting easier.
Right.
But in reality, they're going to push you really hard. They just don't want the soldiers to collapse.
Haha, yes, that's exactly right. That's what they did.
So that's what Europe has done.
Yes, they basically pushed everyone to keep running hard.
Even if some people started screaming, they could always stop at that point.
Yeah, so they slowly lowered the levels, adjusting gradually, and if they found that things weren't working, they'd stop at that level.
If it were my savings, I'd probably think, let's not withdraw from savings and just take a loan. That's what people do, right? It's like why people use cash services on the street. It's just easier than closing a fund. Even though banks might find it a hassle, they still have to calculate everything and get approvals. Don't we need to process that payment?
So, while I don't fully understand the European financial system, it seems that's what they're doing. Since I've already mentioned it, let me read you this article from March 15th. It talks about Schnabel. This guy is smart, a genius. He's a board member, and what he said was that the narrowed 15 BP spread would help support a sound Eurosystem balance sheet and financial stability. If banks hold too many reserves, they might cut liquidity too much, making them vulnerable to liquidity shocks. In other words, banks might start withdrawing all their deposits. If the spread is too narrow, however, banks could end up hoarding reserves, seeing the central bank as the main source of lending, which reduces their incentive to prepare for short-term liquidity risks in the broader financial system. Powell and his team likely did their research on this issue, right? That 15 basis point spread wasn't just a random figure. They probably ran several models to arrive at it. If it doesn't work out as expected, they might reduce the spread even further, perhaps down to the CBP level. This would make banks start questioning, should we take that step or not? While we can't fully understand the exact internal workings of these banks, the 15 BP system likely has a strong rationale behind it. And since we're on this subject, even if some people aren't too interested, it's really worth studying how the Fed is managing quantitative tightening, QT. It's important to know, right? So what makes the Fed unique in this situation is that, as mentioned earlier, it has experienced the painful consequences of QT before. They've been through difficult times with QT at one point, and those lessons are informing their approach now. The pain of QT was felt back in September 2019 during the repo crisis when they withdrew money and chaos ensued. Now let's look at it. The Fed pumped up the money supply significantly during COVID, with bank reserves increasing to $5 trillion. But they've been doing QT for over a year and a half, almost 2 years. As a result, the reserves have dropped to about $3.3 trillion. So you're still going to reduce, right? The market is worried, and then another incident happens. If it drops to this level, you all will be in big trouble. That's what I'm saying. Currently, we are all here, floating and swimming, and this is something that is being reduced continuously. People are now worried, asking, are they still going to keep reducing it? What if we hit the bottom? That could be disastrous. The market is concerned because everyone's floating right now, and they're continuing to reduce liquidity. Meanwhile, the ECB seems to have identified a rough bottom level by watching when the repo window starts getting busy, reacting to demand. The Fed, however, is taking a different approach by thinking about how it, as the supplier of funds, will operate. So while they've reduced reserves from $5 trillion to $3.3 trillion, no one knows where the bottom is. We can't know this in advance, so we must look at past experiences. So when asked how much was the reserve level during the September 2019 crisis, they said it was around $2 trillion. At that time, the US GDP was about $21 trillion. Thus, the recent thinking is that banks need to hold reserves equivalent to 8 to 12% of the US GDP. That's the range they're aiming for now. About 8 to 12% of the US GDP should be the danger zone. This is what the Fed is currently considering as the danger level. However, they still have quite a bit of room left, so they are gradually reducing the reserves from here. The US GDP is now about $28 trillion. If you take 8-12%, the upper end would be around $3 trillion. Between $2.5 trillion to $3 trillion is where the critical point lies. Somewhere in that range is the point where things could go wrong. We don't know exactly where that critical point is. Now we're at $3.3 trillion. Since we've already come down from $5 trillion to $3.3 trillion, there's not much left.
What do you mean by 3.3 trillion?
Since we've already reduced reserves from $5 trillion to $3.3 trillion, there's not much left to go. Banks had an excess of $5 trillion, but now we've come down to $3 trillion. If we keep lowering it to somewhere between $2.5 trillion and $3 trillion, that's where things could start to go wrong. The exact tipping point is hard to pinpoint. We don't know when it'll happen. It's not like someone can suddenly say, the magic number is 2.34 trillion. So what do we do from here? We have to proceed cautiously, reducing reserves slowly and methodically, little by little. Previously, quantitative tightening was cutting $95 billion per month, but now we need to adjust at a more measured pace. Let me illustrate this with an example. The problem lies somewhere between $2.5 trillion and $3 trillion. Right now, we've been steadily reducing reserves from $5 trillion, cutting down by $95 billion each month. At this point, we've reached $3.3 trillion. If we keep reducing further into that critical range, trouble could arise suddenly and unexpectedly. Naturally, people are starting to ask, what should we do? Should we stop QT altogether? The more opportunistic and greedy players in the market are saying, oh, it's too risky. We should stop now before it's too late. They smile as they say this, but the Fed knows that smile. The Fed sees it and thinks, I knew you'd say that. So what needs to be done now? We need to keep going. But the finish line is close. We can't rush to the end, right? So we have to go step by step, slowly reducing. That's why instead of cutting $95 billion per month, they've reduced it to $60 billion. They're slowing down the pace. By reducing the pace, they're trying to stop at the most precise point. So now here's where we are. You could interpret reducing quantitative tightening from $95 billion to $60 billion as a dovish monetary policy, which sounds good. But if you flip that view, it could mean they're going deeper, just more slowly. So for the ECB, by narrowing the gap between the deposit rate and the refi rate, they're strategically fine-tuning their approach to better manage liquidity. As for the Fed, they're still pulling back on QT, but now they're doing it more gradually and cautiously, carefully searching for that precise danger zone where things could go wrong.
Both are now engaged in a precision operation.
Yes, exactly. At the recent FOMC meeting, Chair Powell was asked if QT would stop. The question came up because lowering rates adds liquidity while QT pulls money out. Isn't it counterproductive to release money through rate cuts while simultaneously pulling it back through QT? Powell essentially responded, not yet, pointing out that they still have $3.3 trillion in reserves and will continue the process. This likely disappointed the market, as many had expected QT to come to a halt by year's end. Initially, the market believed that both major axes of monetary policy would stop by the end of this year, but that now seems less likely. To stop by the year's end, the Fed would need to start signaling in September, evaluate the situation in November, and then officially pause in December. However, when Powell said not yet in September, the prevailing sentiment now is that QT might continue well into next year, lasting longer than initially expected.
During quantitative easing, even with interest rates at zero, people were still claiming that money was tight and rates felt too high. So, the Fed stepped in and flooded the financial system with far more liquidity than needed, which was essentially the core of what quantitative easing aimed to do, right? But now, with US interest rates hitting 5%, which is relatively high, it raises the question, where did all that money injected during QE actually end up? What happened to all that liquidity that was supposed to be in the system?
The reserves were held within the banks and specifically parked at the Fed, where the Federal Reserve maintains several accounts for this purpose. One key account is called the Treasury General Account, TGA, where the government deposits its funds, essentially acting as the Treasury's own account. The second account is where the Fed holds commercial banks' reserves. This account functions as a storage for the reserves that commercial banks keep within the Federal Reserve.
Which is where most of the QE money ended up, right?
Yes, that is accurate. Nonetheless, a portion of the quantitative easing, QE funds, circulated into the market via bank deposits, and this is where the reverse repurchase, RRP facility, plays a role. Entities such as hedge funds, the U.S. Housing Finance Agency, and money market funds, MMFs, utilize the reverse repo account. Together, these accounts held nearly $9 trillion. This money wasn't being actively circulated, so it sat there.
That money isn't needed in the market, so it will probably just keep stacking up there, right?
It's not that the money wasn't needed. There are various reasons for implementing quantitative easing, QE. One reason might be to stimulate the economy, but the more fundamental reason is this. When banks run low on cash, it can lead to a financial crisis. If people think the banks are failing, the central bank needs to provide reassurance that the banks won't collapse. How do you show that? By showing the banks have plenty of cash reserves thanks to QE. So people see that and think, oh, everything is fine. However, banks sometimes face another issue. Even if they have enough money, they often buy long-term bonds to earn a little extra interest since it's tough to survive otherwise. They borrow short-term and invest in long-term bonds. But when a crisis hits, everyone suddenly needs cash, so they all try to sell their long-term bonds at the same time. That causes bond prices to plummet, making it impossible to liquidate them for cash. In extreme situations, banks might say, I have a 10-year bond, but no one will be interested. All they'll want is cash, and bonds won't suffice. That's precisely when the Fed steps in, buying up those long-term bonds and converting them into cash to stabilize the system and provide liquidity where it's needed most. So, banks end up with cash reserves. This process builds confidence that banks won't fail. The impact of QE wasn't just about flooding the stock market with money. It was about ensuring banks could avoid bankruptcy. However, if too much money floods the system, it can drive interest rates down into negative territory, making it difficult for central banks to control rates using conventional policy. When massive amounts of money are pumped into the system, it becomes impossible to absorb all that liquidity. That's why the European Central Bank, ECB, implemented negative deposit rates to soak up some of the excess money.
They essentially said, you can park your reserves here, but don't touch it recklessly.
Exactly. The ECB encouraged this by offering interest on deposits, which is how they manage it. Similarly, the Fed pays interest on reserves, IOR, and reverse repos, RRP, preventing excess liquidity from spreading too far.
This prevents it from circulating in the market.
Exactly. They secured it tightly. By doing this, they prevent money from circulating too much in the real economy. This is what you described as the corridor system.
However, banks still need to keep a bit of bluff money, so to speak. Banks fundamentally operate on trust, so if the market starts doubting them, they need to have a backup reserve. If there's trust, they don't need as much of a backup. But without trust, that bluff reserve becomes crucial.
Yes, however, now the scale of the economy has grown too large, and after maintaining this bubble structure for too long, the bubble has become real. Even though it's bluff money, banks still need to hold on to around $3 trillion to maintain stability. If it drops below that, it starts to get worrisome, as seen in the 2019 repo crisis. To prevent another similar crisis, the Federal Reserve has been moving cautiously. It's not just about cutting rates by 60 basis points or scaling back quantitative tightening. As you said, It's more like switching to lighter uniforms for a challenging summer training, offering the impression of relief without actually easing the pressure in any real way.
So all that surplus money remains tied up with the banks and doesn't flow out into the economy.
Yes, but when banks are flush with cash like this, they don't feel the need to lend to each other at higher rates, which keeps interest rates low. The side effect of quantitative easing is that it drives interest rates down, inflating the prices of safe assets. Since these safe assets no longer provide returns, and with negative interest rates, holding them starts to incur a penalty. This greatly reduces the appeal of holding safe assets. By driving interest rates into negative territory, it makes holding these assets even less attractive, further diminishing their favorability. People who want to make money are forced out of safe assets and continually pushed away from secure investments. So what do they do next? They begin seeking out longer-term or riskier investments that offer the promise of slightly higher returns. This in turn drives them to take on more and more risk. As more money flows into these longer-term, riskier assets, it starts moving into corporate bonds, stocks, real estate, and other financial markets. Over time, this process slowly inflates asset prices across various sectors, and the risk of a bubble forming becomes more and more real, adding to the growing systemic risk in the broader economy.
During the last FOMC meeting, they discussed lowering interest rates, which is a separate issue to consider. But at the same time, quantitative tightening, QT, is also progressing, absorbing liquidity from the market. This shows that both policies are continuing concurrently.
In the September FOMC meeting, a journalist raised a question about the balance sheet reduction process, specifically asking whether there were any concerns regarding the stability of reserves in the banking system. The response clarified that reserves in the system remain stable and sufficient, which indicates that there's still more than enough liquidity in bank reserves. As a result, there's no pressing need to halt or slow down the pace of the balance sheet reduction at this time. They emphasized that for the moment, there are no plans to pause the reduction process. Instead, they will maintain their current course while keeping a close watch on the evolving situation, making any necessary adjustments as they proceed. Furthermore, they explained that both lowering interest rates and QT can happen simultaneously. So lowering interest rates is part of normalizing the excessively high rates, while QT is about pulling back the excess liquidity that was injected into the market. During that discussion, they mentioned it's possible to reduce the balance sheet while lowering rates for a period of time. Someone asked, isn't lowering rates injecting money while QT pulls it out? Isn't that contradictory? The response was, we can do both for a while, so stop worrying.
What they meant is that market liquidity and excess reserves, bluff money, are managed separately. So even if market liquidity rises with lower rates, they can still reduce excess reserves. That's the explanation they gave.
Yes, exactly. They are saying that despite the market's insistence to stop quantitative tightening, QT, there still needs to be a minimum amount of reserves for the stability of the financial system. The market is pushing for a halt, but the response is that they are managing it in a way that ensures stability, and they will continue with QT.
So I had the same question. All that surplus money from the zero interest rate era, at 5%, it should have been absorbed or gone by now. But they're saying the money is still there, which is why they're saying we need to keep doing QT, quantitative tightening. Meanwhile, the market interest rates are near zero, and the explanation is that they've been managing this in two separate tracks. So even if market interest rates drop, this QT continues. That's the explanation they gave.
Yes, that's right. So as I mentioned earlier, there is a minimum level of reserves that must exist to ensure the stability of the financial system. This is the basis on which the market keeps protesting, asking to stop QT, quantitative tightening, and in response they are saying, we are handling it like this.
The excess liquidity that was released into the market couldn't be fully absorbed just by raising the interest rates, and it wasn't possible to handle it that way. So, it was separately gathered and managed, while the other aspects were being handled separately. So, in conclusion, both Europe and the US will continue with QT as planned. At the same time, interest rates will be lowered. But the question remains, will market liquidity increase or decrease? When interest rates are lowered, it's widely known that liquidity in the market increases. However, If QT continues, market liquidity could decrease. So, people might ask, will liquidity increase or decrease moving forward? We'll address this question in part 2. Apologies, but we have to run our business too, so please stay tuned for part 2.